Nordicism in ancient Greece, Rome, and other regions. Ancient Greece and Rome were comprised of a mixture of Anatolian-descended early European farmer peasants as well as Nordic elites. These Nordic elites came from the invading pastoralist tribes from the north, known as the Dorians and Ionians, and they were the ones who developed early Greek civilization. They invaded Italy and Greece and subjugated the Anatolian-descended farming populations that lived there and made them into their underclass, which they ruled over. While later on, near the end of classical civilization, when Rome was declining, there were additional peoples migrating from Anatolia, as well as Semitic peoples from the Middle East and North Africa, who were also starting to migrate into the Iberian and Italian peninsulas, as well as Greece. This led to the eventual end of the Greco-Roman world through the original Nordic Aryan ruling class getting overwhelmed and mixed out of existence altogether. The Roman Empire ended up being the political entity that united all of the classical world, after Macedon briefly had that title as uniter of the Hellenistic world, but couldn't keep it. So Rome ended up being the one who took over and became the new center of gravity for the classical world. When the Roman Empire was declining from all of the new blood from the south and the east, as well as the continued mixing of the Latin, patrician, Dorian, Ionian, and Achaean blood, with that of the plebeian, Aeolian, Aetolian, and Pelasgian ethnic groups, this led to a decline in their quality of blood, and it also led to their society and military going into a decline as well because of this mass migration and, as a consequence, mass miscegenation. The evidence for this is both genetic and textual as well as artistic. For genetic studies, we can cite the articles Ancient Genomes Reveal Structural Shifts After the Arrival of Steppe-Related Ancestry in the Italian Peninsula, and The Genomic History of the Aegean Palatial Civilizations, as well as Ancient Rome, A Genetic Crossroads of Europe and the Mediterranean, which say that the Italian Peninsula and Greece in ancient times had a much more Northern European genetic makeup. And for artistic examples, we can look at all of the various ancient Greek statuary that has been recolored in archaeological artistic reconstructions. It is also worth noting that many ancient Greek statues have blonde hair and pale skin, as revealed after archaeologists started reconstructing the paint on the statues from the ancient residue. There are a number of examples, among them Alexander the Great, whose famous bust, created by the sculptor Lysippos, does not survive, but later copies of it have survived, and through these reconstructions based on paint residue, it has been shown what the original color patterns on the statue looked like. And what it reveals is that Alexander was originally portrayed with blonde hair, pale skin, and Nordic facial features. There are also other depictions from the generations after Alexander lived, which continue to portray him in this way. And for those who say that these depictions were just idealizations, or that this was just Alexander who was portrayed this way, it should be known that this was actually the common way to depict lots of famous individuals in ancient Greece and Rome, especially elites, and it was not just Alexander who was portrayed in this way. And as far as the possibility that these are just idealizations go, this simply does not make sense, because why would the ancient Greek and Roman elites have idealized the appearance of their Germanic barbarian neighbors to the north, who they often mocked and looked down on? Tacitus does seem to like and idealize them, but other Romans at the time castigated him for it. So praising the barbarians of the north and the west was not something that was normal for the time. The more simple explanation is that the Roman and Greek elites really looked like that. The Greco-Roman elites really had a Nordic and oftentimes blonde appearance, and that's why it was an idealized appearance. Otherwise, it would make no sense for them to portray their leaders as looking like foreigners whom they look down on. And as for why the Greeks and Romans don't look this way anymore, the reason why is simple. It is because the Roman Empire accepted large numbers of migrants who came from the Near East, of Semitic and Anatolian descent, into southern Europe and changed the racial makeup of the region for millennia to come. It is also worth noting that a part of the reason for this change could be that the Greek and Roman elites mixed with their underclass of agricultural laborers, descended from the even more ancient Anatolian migrant population of early European farmers that arrived in Europe in prehistory before the Dorians, Ionians, and Achaeans invaded. These farmers were the people who created the Mycenaean and Minoan civilizations. The reason why these civilizations ended was because of the Dorian, Ionian, and Achaean invasions of Indo-European Aryan pastoralist tribes. Millennia later, it was the mixing out of the Indo-European Nordic elites, known as the Dorians, Ionians, Achaeans, and Patricians, who ruled the classical world, because they mated with their Aeolian, Aetolian, plebeian, and Pelasgian underclass, who were of different racial stock, that led to the decline and eventual dissolution of these ancient Nordic elites and became the ruin of the classical world. So it is only fitting that mixing with these farmers that they conquered in the past, as well as mixing with these Middle Eastern, Semitic, and Anatolian migrants whom they conquered and brought into their region later on, ended up coming back to bite them and ended up being their undoing. It is also worth noting that the reason why they had so many Middle Eastern and Anatolian migrants is because the Roman Empire invited them in, because they needed more slaves to support their short-sighted and corrupt patrician elites. For textual sources, we can cite Euripides, who describes Hercules as blonde, an uncommon hair color for people of Mediterranean descent. Here he says, quote, "Cleared the grove of Zeus of a lion, and put its skin upon his back, hiding his yellow hair in its fearful tawny gaping jaws," end quote. Homer also says that Achilles was blonde, as well as Zeus, and that Hera was fair-haired. Quote, "Even as when the lord of fair-haired Hera lighteneth what time he maketh ready," end quote. There are also countless pieces of artwork that depict the people of the time as having light skin and blonde hair, including famous figures such as Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Plato, Aristotle, and all of the gods. Critics might argue that blonde hair was only popular during the later empire, as a symbol for prostitutes, and then even later as a beauty ideal for elite Roman women who would buy wigs from Gaul. But this was only in the late empire. During the early days of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, blonde hair and light skin were far more common. It was a common occurrence for ancient Indo-European or Aryan tribes to go conquering and subjugating primitive farming populations all over the Middle East and Eurasia. There has been evidence, both linguistic, textual, and in recent years, even genetic studies, that have already been cited both in this article and in the last one on Nordicism. And consistently, what appears every time is that Nordic-looking men, tribal warriors who spurn labor and love adventure, always eventually conquer primitive farmers and use them as laborers, so they themselves can become landed aristocrats. Even the term aristocrat comes from Aryan, the name that all of these Nordic-looking pastoralist tribes identified themselves as already cited earlier and in the last article. So in light of the evidence for there being a Nordic-looking ruling class in Greece and Rome, it would be safe to say that this seems to be a pattern occurring all over the world. A pattern that is deliberately ignored, downplayed, or even angrily debunked by mainstream academia, who feel that theories like this are too imperialist or colonialist and contradict their own post-colonial, irrational religious dogmas. It should be explained that there are different kinds of races or tribes or cultures, and that most cultures fall into the categories of either being rulers/masters or being ruled/slaves. And this tends to correspond to cultures being either farming-based or pastoralist and or hunter-gatherer-based societies. The nature of cultures is determined by their lifestyles, which over the generations start to become reflected in their biology and in their moral values. A culture that is based in farming tends to believe that labor is good and that backbreaking toil is something to be proud of, and that violence or ambition are social ills. While a tribe of pastoralists would be more likely to believe that labor is a curse or something to be ashamed of, and that war and violence, adventure, ambition, and daring are all great virtues to be upheld. And when these cultures interact with each other, it usually leads to the pastoralists raiding and plundering the farmers, and over time, the pastoralists will probably just outright oppress them and rule them indefinitely. At this point, the pastoralist tribe has become a landed aristocracy. and the memory of the conquest might fade over time, and even the memory of being two different tribes might also fade over time. But it will be remembered in subtle ways, such as the aristocratic obsession with their noble blood, or their desire to not breed with the commoners, or their sense of superiority and their otherwise unexplained belief that they have a right to rule, and that this rule is justified. Some examples of non-Aryan ruling tribes or races would be the Huns, the Mongols, the Tamils, the Khazars, the Japanese, or even the American Indians. It is also worth noting that hunter-gatherers can also be considered rulers as well, if not outright settling and ruling, which is unlikely since hunter-gatherers never seem to settle into a landed aristocracy the way pastoralists do. But they are raiders, and they do reject labor, so hunter-gatherers can be thought of as examples of a proto-master race. It is also worth noting that there are other Aryan tribes that existed in places that one would not expect them to be in, such as the Tocharians, who are a red-haired and sometimes blonde-haired Aryan tribal people of semi-nomadic lifestyle. Some Tocharians lived like farmers and were a branch off from the original nomadic warrior Tocharians, who still maintained their lifestyle. Evidence of them and their Indo-European facial features and hair color can be found in the archaeology of the Tarim mummies, although the Chinese refer to them as the Yuezhi instead of as Tocharian. Separately, there was also the Xiongnu, who were a non-Aryan people of Northeast Asian descent and led a tribal nomadic warrior confederacy of many other racial groups, which they conquered and brought under their control. And during the Han Dynasty, they tried to harass and conquer the Han Chinese but failed, because of Chinese ingenuity, and more specifically, because of the creation of the Great Wall. There are numerous Chinese historical sources describing them as being a constant barbarian threat from the steppe, which caused them to build the Great Wall for defensive purposes, as just stated. There were many other migrations and conquests of Aryan Indo-European tribes across the world. They left their mark, both genetic and cultural, on other peoples that they mixed with and conquered, and they left telltale signs such as the spreading of the swastika symbol all over Eurasia. The swastika can be found in places as far afield as Scandinavia, Rome, Ukraine, Celtic tribes, Greece, India, China, and even Japan. This shows how far the Aryan tribes conquered, since either they or their cousin tribes spread to all of these places. The Japanese probably never had any Aryan tribes, but they are descended from other non-Aryan pastoralists who originally migrated from the steppe. Japanese historians refer to these tribes as the Torajin. They were more specifically descended from North Eurasian and Korean horse-riding warrior clans, and once they entered Japan, they went on to be the aristocratic warrior ruling elites. And over time, they produced all of the warrior elites of Japan. This is according to Japanese archaeologist Agami Namio's theory, known as the horse rider theory. The Uji aristocratic clans arrived in Japan during the Kofun period, and helped establish the unified Yamato state on behalf of the emperor. They then gradually lost their power to bureaucracy in later centuries, and then regained it again during Japan's feudal period, but now the Uji were known as the samurai. Originally, these horse-riding elites were known as the Gozoku, or Uji warrior elites, and then they declined in vitality and became a weak and bureaucratic elite who then were overthrown by the lower-ranking Kuge warrior clans. And in later centuries, they were replaced again by the samurai warrior clans, who in turn declined and became bureaucratic and eventually got overthrown again. But this time they were overthrown by the quasi-democratic government of Meiji-era Japan, and there has not been an aristocratic government in Japan since, the only quasi-exception being the World War II-era Japanese government, which was militaristic but still bureaucratic and not aristocratic in its structure nor in its culture, since it also failed to have an aristocratic culture. In summary on Japan, we can say that the aristocratic elites of Japan were originally comprised of foreign clans of invaders who held to an aristocratic way of life, that being they were warrior nomadic pastoralists who brought their master ideology with them to ancient Japan as they migrated into and invaded ancient Japan millennia ago. They then became the aristocratic ruling class of Japan for centuries. The Native Americans also had the swastika in their culture. This is probably because the American Indians are themselves a distant cousin of the Aryan tribes. This is why they also have similar customs surrounding the war band of youths, who have to leave the tribe in their late teens and go hunting and conquering other tribes. This existed in the Aryan Indo-European world as the Koreos, and in later millennia as the Germanic Mannerbund. It is also worth noting that the gods of the Mayans, Aztecs, Nazcas, and Incas are given Nordic Aryan descriptions of these cultures as being blonde, white, tall, and oftentimes bearded, even though these peoples cannot grow very strong beards and tend to be short and stocky and not tall and thin. These peoples are also not fair-complected or blonde, and yet they describe their gods this way. This either points to ancient contact with Aryan tribes, or even Aryan tribes being the ones who founded all of these civilizations before being mixed out of existence, before the time of Cortez and Pizarro's arrival in the 1500s. And it would have had to have been long enough ago to not be shown on the faces of the people. In other words, the Aryans being fully mixed out into their peasant population. Or it could mean something more profound. It could mean that the divine really looks like this, and that the Nordic Aryan type is truly closer to the divine than other tribes, and that it is a more accurate reflection of the divine. Or it could be a case of ancient astronauts, or even some combination of all three of these scenarios. This still leaves the question of what happened to these elites, and the answer to that would be that they eventually either died out because of outbreeding with peasant farmers such as the Vedic Aryan elites of India, or the Aryan elites of ancient Persia, or because of inbreeding and becoming more dumb and making worse decisions while becoming more biologically lame, both physically and intellectually. Otherwise, in Europe, the medieval aristocrats did mix with the peasants heavily, especially in later centuries, as they loosened the formerly quite harsh restrictions, but somehow didn't die out, although now this happens far more than it did in centuries past. In other words, we are in the process of the outbreeding of the currently existing noble families that still exist in the West. Now they are simultaneously suffering from an outbreeding problem as well as an inbreeding problem, since they are both a small population and by consequence, they also have a small gene pool, which causes the inbreeding, and at the same time they have an issue with marrying people with non-aristocratic blood. They are a doomed population ultimately. But their situation is different from India or Persia or Egypt, because at least the racial type with which they are breeding out with is of a very similar racial type to them to begin with. The European farming peasants were most likely a distant cousin of the original Aryan conquerors in ancient Europe. In other words, the Longhouse culture of ancient Europe was probably a spin-off branch of a common ancestor with the Aryan Indo-European tribes. Maybe this common ancestor was the Proto-Indo-Europeans, or maybe something even older like the ancient North Eurasian, or maybe something even older than that, who knows? So the outbreeding of the Aryan elites in Europe with the peasant populations is probably not as disastrous as it was for other Aryan-ruled civilizations, and other aristocratic-ruled civilizations where the rulers are of such a different racial type from the peasants, and commoners, and other free men. This means that the inevitable outbreeding that comes from this relationship of rulers and ruled is that at least the civilization that is created from it is not so racially bastardized and declined compared to other civilizations where the elites are totally mixed out into a population of peasants that are so different and so much less capable than they are.